Hey, what's up, everybody? It's the Grayzone. Max Blumenthal here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate. And there's so much going on that I wanted to make sure I could be as up-to-date as possible. So apologies for starting late. Right now, as Israel possibly enters the Gaza Strip for ground offensive, possibly. There is a momentous vote at the United Nations on an amendment to call for a ceasefire. And Western support for that amendment is gathering. Basically, the U.S. Rep. Linda Thomas Greenfield performatively denounced the non-aligned countries pushing the ceasefire for not including Hamas in the resolution, denouncing Hamas, calling for a release of captives. And so they've amended the language. And now a lot of the Western states are coming along. Possibly, I don't know if what's happening, if the U.S. is going to come along. They've obviously blocked the Russian ceasefire amendment. They blocked the Brazilian ceasefire resolution. But things are happening, and that seems to have pushed. I'm not sure, but we're seeing, because we don't know what's actually happening in Gaza because Israel's cut all the communications. Everything is dark there. Jawal, the main phone provider, Paltel, they've all gone offline. That may have prompted Israel to wage a two-front war, one against Gaza on land, launching an invasion, and against the United Nations and international diplomacy, a political war. And so I think during this stream, we might find out what's actually happening. We are going to be joined by Gabor Mate for a moment of sanity in about 20 minutes. Aaron, how's it going? Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We kind of have to, it's hard to talk right now when we fathom what is taking place as we speak. Israel's carpet bombing Gaza with what looks like the most intense bombings to date, which is hard to fathom given how unbelievably genocidal and murderous things have already gone. But as Max said, the internet, phone lines have been totally cut off from Gaza. So it's people, and it's hard to imagine saying this, are even more cut off from the rest of the world, are even more besieged than ever before. And that's just, we're dealing with, this is a modern day Holocaust. That's what we're watching, a Nazi regime inflicting genocide before our eyes with our government's full support, the full support of the Biden administration, which is denying death tolls, which is openly boasting that more people in Gaza are going to die, John Kirby, which is shedding crocodile tears for Israelis who were killed on October 7th, but basically cheering on and denying the murder of Gazans. It's an unbelievable moment.
So Israel's, according to Wael Dahdouh, the Al Jazeera reporter whose entire nuclear family was killed in a targeted strike by Israel 2 days ago. The 100 warplanes are operating in the Gaza Strip right now. Intense bombing. The Beit Lahia refugee camp in the north has been especially targeted. There have been several massacres today. We can't say how many or how many have been dead. We're hearing just scattered reports of bodies being found in the streets throughout northern Gaza. I can show some of that in a second, but I think you're seeing the skies being lit up by Israeli warplanes, possibly laying the groundwork for a ground invasion. And as I mentioned, they targeted all the communications equipment. This is what Gaza looked like earlier today.
Allah, Ya Allah.
This is the Holocaust that Aaron mentioned earlier. The death toll 48 hours ago passed 7,000, according to Gaza's health ministry, which has published all the names of the dead. The child death toll has tracked at about the usual population rate. of 50% of the Gaza Strip, and so we can safely assume that 3,500 children are dead, or people under 18. And these are just the scenes that are common all across the Gaza Strip. We're unable to reach anyone inside right now. And I think I can spare you more of the carnage. We have tons of footage of massacres. And as I said, it's impossible to record them. Israel comes at night. It tends to kill most at night with its warplanes. And so that was just during the day. And we've seen some discussion. Well, we heard from Daniel Harari, the Israeli army spokesman, that they're expanding ground operations, which could be code for ground invasion. One Telegram channel that's still operating from Gaza has reported a tank incursion in the north. And then you have, this is Daniel Harari, the Israeli army spokesperson, essentially telegraphing that they want to attack the only building still standing in the Al Rimal neighborhood of central Gaza City. Everything else has been totally destroyed. It's where all the administrative centers are. And this is the Al Shifa Hospital, which has 4,000 beds, and thousands of people, basically the entire Al Rimal neighborhood, are sheltering there because they have nowhere else to go because they're all homeless. They can either go there or they can go south to who knows where, to tent cities. Israel's attacking Khan Yunis. They've attacked the Nuseirat refugee camp. They've attacked everywhere along the way to Rafah.
Start with Shifa Hospital, located in Gaza City, the biggest hospital in Gaza.
Daniel Hagari.
This is the Shifa Hospital. You can see where it locates in Gaza City, the largest hospital in Gaza. It has over 1,500 beds, 4,000 staff, and now it has also more people around the surroundings of the hospital. The red marks that you've seen before and you'll see later are red marks of buildings that are involved with Hamas, and we know it, and we have the proofs that they are with involvement of Hamas.
So basically, he presents a mock-up and audio of phone calls as proof that Hamas's military high command, the Al-Qassam brigades, are operating offices under the Al-Shifa hospital in tunnels, and announcing essentially that this is their main target. It's unclear to me what they're going to do. I've been to Al-Shifa hospital several times. If they attack Al-Shifa hospital, it would be one of the worst military massacres or massacres of civilians in history that we can think of in our lifetimes. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people there, and thousands of people there at all times. And it's on a very small slice of land surrounded by a tight warren of shops and restaurants. So the irony here is that if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it says IDF HQ Tel Aviv, and that's where he's speaking from. He's speaking from Hakiria, which is a giant complex in Tel Aviv that includes several skyscrapers or large office towers, and it's nestled in the middle of a civilian neighborhood in Tel Aviv, surrounded by residential areas. It's near the Azrieli shopping mall, the biggest shopping mall in Tel Aviv. And so basically this guy is speaking from within a civilian area in the military headquarters of Israel. He himself is using them as human shields while saying Hamas is using a hospital as human shields. And without presenting proof, they're just these phone calls between people in Gaza. They're not even they're intercepted phone calls, and one person is saying, "Oh yeah, they're all under there. They're under that hospital." I think it's important that we pay attention to this presentation.
So they have animation, basically. They're showing us animation, and this is their supposed proof. And those phone calls, which they claim are intercepted, this is the same army that put out a supposed intercepted phone call from some Palestinian militants after the hospital bombing, claiming that these two militants admitted that the rockets were fired from near there. And of course, people pointed out that the accents were really off, did not sound like people from Gaza. And there was even a forensic analysis done on the audio, which basically showed that it had been manipulated and recorded on separate channels. And
Right.
again, even if you ignore that scrutiny there, the very fact that this military, the same one that lacked the intelligence capabilities to pick up that Hamas was planning October 7th, they now want us to believe that they can intercept phone calls from Hamas militants, which just happen to validate the core aims of Israeli propaganda. It's such a joke. It's such a joke. And of course, the US media, trained to parrot whatever the Israeli government says, goes along with it. But anybody with their eyes open can see. I mean, this government is historically mendacious. They lie all the time. They commit massacres and lie all the time. So this is nothing new. There's no reason to take anything they say seriously.
No, absolutely not. We can assume that there are tunnels. There are tunnels because
That
there's
is true.
pretty much nowhere
Yes.
else to go.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, those phone calls. Well, the phone calls were introduced kind of as a propaganda measure to deflect from the bombing of the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza City, where at least 100 were killed, maybe as many as 500 were killed. And that phone call, the accents were Lebanese. Arabic speakers pointed that out immediately. I know, just having been in Egypt and in Lebanon, like I can even tell the Arabic is different. Gaza Arabic is closer to Egyptian Arabic. You'll hear people use expressions like "ya rogil" and like "what's up, man" is like an Egyptian expression. You won't even hear that in the West Bank. People eat differently in the Gaza Strip. They like spicier food because they're closer to the Egyptians. And it's like that distinction was completely papered over because that phone call and a lot of this propaganda is not for the consumption of discerning media consumers or people in the Arab world. It's for the consumption of American dupes and also for Zionists, just to keep them on board as they continue to prosecute this massacre. They need to believe that, oh, well, we didn't do it. They bombed their own hospital. And now, oh, well, if we bomb that hospital, the terrorists who are just as bad as ISIS are underground.
Yeah. And all this, look, even if you don't care, if you're one of those people who doesn't care about the civilians of Gaza, right? The Israeli government and the US government claim that their top priority is freeing the hostages that Hamas is holding. Well, we've already seen Hamas release 4 people. If Israel wanted to, it could engage in negotiations directly. And what is Hamas asking for? Their demands were just relayed by the Washington Post. Here it is. Hamas was proposing to release all foreign civilian hostages. Let me make this bigger. In exchange for a 5-day ceasefire. Israeli civilian hostages would be released if additional demands are met, including the release of Palestinian women and children in Israeli prisons and the opening of the Rafah border crossing so wounded civilians can receive care in Egypt and fuel, food, and medicine and water can enter Gaza. But again, Israel's position is that no fuel can enter Gaza, which means that babies in incubators can die, water pumps can't work, because they don't want actually to free these hostages, because they want to maintain any excuse they can to undertake what they're committing, which is mass murder.
Yeah, it's like Kuwaiti incubator babies, but real. The United Nations announced yesterday that Gaza's food situation was catastrophic. The hospitals have, Al Shifa, for example, has announced they have 36 hours left of fuel before they can no longer operate. So we will see a massacre of civilians, of pregnant women, of people. I mean, you have people in Al Shifa on dialysis who will simply die. I've been to the dialysis center there. At every level, it's a catastrophe. The oncology wards are shutting down. And obviously people can't get out for emergency treatment that they can't get inside Gaza. And then you have something like 20,000, at least 20,000 injured people, including critically injured people. You have the last figure I saw a week ago was 1,400 people missing. According to Gaza rescue crews, hundreds of people are trapped under the rubble and can't be rescued because they don't have the tools, the powerful tools that were granted by like NATO, British intelligence to the Syrian white helmets, who have been showered with awards and welcomed in parliaments around the world. But the heroes saving lives in Gaza hospitals, well, they're just getting in the way of empire. So we're not hearing too much about them. We're not hearing much about the heroic journalists in the Gaza Strip, like Wael Dadu, who's back on air after his entire family was killed. From the Western press has nothing to say about them. They're not giving a pat on their back to their colleague. They don't even see him as a colleague. So,
and when was his home bombed? It was right after Antony Blinken reportedly was pressuring Qatar to, quote, tone down its coverage of Gaza. So Blinken, while he's encouraging the Israeli assault on Gaza, is directing his energies to encourage Al Jazeera to stop covering it properly. And right after he does that, then a home of a prominent, of probably the most prominent Al Jazeera journalist inside Gaza, or at least one of them, gets bombed. And you have to wonder if there's a connection there.
Yeah. Antony Blinken actually made that demand to Qatar on October 13th. And then he revealed that he did it, or boasted about it, according to Axios, in a speech to quote unquote American Jewish leaders. So he told them to turn down the volume. This is Wael Dadu back on camera after his family, his son was killed, his 7-year-old daughter was killed, his 18-month-old grandson was killed, his wife was killed. And Antony Blinken was boasting about trying to turn down the volume on Al Jazeera to Israel lobbyists. Why? Because Biden's running for re-election. He needs their support. There's no other reason. So this guy, as Antony Blinken parades around the world boasting about his support for press freedom, one of the most prominent journalists in the Arab world, is collateral damage for Antony Blinken and Joe Biden's re-election campaign at home. And Israel, did Israel deliberately target him? A prominent Israeli journalist went on Israel's Channel 13 and said we didn't like his coverage. We had to kill him. I'm missing the video of that right now, but it's in Hebrew without translation. Take my word for it. It's disgusting. And, we have a piece up on the site at thegrayzone.com by Wyatt Reed compiling info on all the Palestinian journalists who've been targeted, killed, had their houses bombed. Tamer El-Mashal, another very prominent Al Jazeera Arabic journalist, first had his entire channel deleted by Meta one day after he published a special documentary at Al Jazeera Arabic on Meta's censorship of Palestinian outlets. And then at the beginning of Israel's assault, his house was bombed. We're also seeing doctors, directors of hospitals, the director of the Indonesian hospital, which is on the verge of running out of fuel in the north of Gaza. His family was killed in a targeted strike because he refused to evacuate the hospital. In the south, in Rafah, Dr. Sohail Hams, who I visited in the Kuwaiti hospital, Israel demanded that they evacuate. He refused. The day he refused that order, his family was bombed at home. So these are targeted assassinations of doctors, of journalists. It is me, and just, before we bring Gabor in, we're going to bring in Dr. Gabor Mate to put this in perspective. I was at the State Department yesterday for the briefing. For some reason, the spokesman, the FLAC, Matthew Miller, didn't call on me. I can't imagine why. But he was referring to the whole population of Gaza as human shields. And you could see the press pushing him more than they were at the beginning to try to establish some daylight between the State Department and the Israeli government on the notion that there are even civilians in Gaza. He refused to even cite the number that might have been killed in Gaza. he wouldn't budge from that position. And what I wanted to say to him, and what I'll try to do again, is if Antony Blinken is going to accuse China of genocide for its alleged treatment of the Uyghur minority without even alleging that there is any mass killing or systematic killing or any killing taking place, let alone forcible transfer, then how can they veto ceasefire resolutions when Israel is meeting all of the criteria for genocide? You have forced transfer, 1.1 people being forced from the north under penalty of being killed by missile strikes, ordered to leave. You have mass killing on a systematic level, including of political leadership and grassroots people, doctors across the board. And you have genocidal intent, Israeli leadership describing the population of Gaza as inhuman animals, according to former UN Ambassador Dan Gillerman. Member of Knesset Moshe Feiglin called for the annihilation of Gaza. Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, compared Gaza to Dresden and said we must firebomb it. And on and on and on. Genocidal intent is clear. So they're meeting all of the standards for classical genocide. We don't throw around that term lightly. In fact, sometimes we'll challenge it when it's obviously being deployed as atrocity propaganda by the US to overthrow an official enemy, as you see with China. But this is pretty clear. It's pretty clear what's happening here. So with that, Aaron, why don't you introduce our guest, Dr. Gabor Mate?
Well, Gabor Mate is a retired physician and an author and also a survivor of another genocide, the Nazi Holocaust. And we wanted to bring him in just briefly to share his thoughts on what's going on in Gaza. Welcome, Dad.
Welcome.
Hi, how you guys? It's one of those situations where somebody who deals with trauma in my work and who speaks so much, and words really are my métier, the words fail me at this point. It's difficult to explain how I perceive the situation, but in a certain deep sense, I feel that it's the worst thing I've seen in my whole life. And it's impossible to compare atrocities. I mean, nothing compares with the mechanized murder of 5-6 million Jews by the Nazis. What can compare to the slaughter of 3 million Vietnamese civilians by the Americans? The many murders and mass killings that are not even reported in the Western press, such as the Indonesian genocide in East Timor, such as the killing of 100,000 Guatemalan indigenous people in the 1990s by the American and the Israeli trained brutal military in that country. One could go on. But what is different about this is that I've never seen anything so publicly committed, such atrocities perpetrated on television, and the victims are presented as the perpetrators. And either this spectacle, this obscene, vicious spectacle that we're subjected to, is either supported or condoned by the major media and all the politicians. Now, it's obligatory, and I think it's even necessary to say, this is my point of view, is that what happened on October 7th wasn't justifiable, that the killings of civilians, whatever details may yet emerge about intentions or what actually happened, that's not something that should have happened. That was something horrible, and it was an atrocity. But even the need to say that comes out of a culture in which the atrocities of the other side are never called out. No Israeli spokesman, when they talk about their policies, ever asked, do you condemn the pogrom at Hawara in the West Bank earlier this year? Do you condemn the killings of Palestinian children by settlers? Do you condemn the regular attacks by the settlers? Do you understand that the former deputy chief of staff of the Israeli army said that the situation of the Palestinians in the West Bank reminds him of the situation of Jews in Germany? Is this even reported in the Western press? And what he meant by is that the settlers, like the Nazi hooligans, are free to attack the Palestinians as the Nazis, thugs, the brown shirts were free to attack Jews, and the army and the police not only stood by, they aided and abetted them. Is the Western public made aware of the thousands of Jewish Israeli rabbis and historians and intellectuals who recently signed a document calling the present situation clearly apartheid? Are you aware that the former head of Mossad has said that the situation of the Palestinians under the occupation is apartheid? And so when anybody is asked to speak about perpetrations on the Palestinian side, they're immediately asked to condemn and to denounce and to reject. And yet the daily suffering, crucifixion of the Palestinian people, and including and especially the people in Gaza, nobody's ever called to task. Nobody's ever questioned. And these smooth-faced liars in the Israeli army who would give lessons to Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, who are masters of propaganda, like Goebbels never was. They're allowed to get away with it. Now, I'm speaking emotionally now. It's not helpful sometimes to speak emotionally because people get repelled by the anger or by the outrage that one generates. I understand the grief on both sides. I understand the sorrow. I've had communication from Israeli friends who are actually sympathetic to the Palestinian side, who are just in fear, who are full of thoughts of revenge. I get that. I understand it. But surely in this situation, whoever you are, whichever your side you're on, you got to get past your feelings. You can understand your feelings, you can accept them, but you owe, if you want truth, and if you want peace, and if you want justice, you can't just go by feelings that are conditioned by decades of propaganda, decades of weaponizing the suffering of Jews as a baton with which to beat the Palestinians. You got to get past that. And you have to actually ask yourself, do I really know what's going on? Have I stood 1 second even in my mind in the shoes of the other? Have I tried to understand what's happening to those people? If they committed certain acts that are hateful, what drove them to that hate? Did the Palestinians come to Europe to attack Jews? Or did something happen in their land that made them so desperate? And finally, I'll only say that what happened there is not a secret. It's been documented. It's been written up by Israeli historians. I could name 5 of them right off the bat. Tom Segev, Simha Flapan, Ilan Pape, many others by Israeli journalists. None of this is even vaguely controversial from the historical point of view. And the fact that we live in such a bubble, and this bubble is created by the same Western press that brought us the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction, and yes, the Kuwaiti incubator children, leading to the death of 500,000 Iraqi civilians. The same Western press that brought us the Vietnam War. When Martin Luther King spoke out against the Vietnam War, do you remember what the New York Times said? New York Times said, this time he crossed over the line. It's that same press. You might want to ask yourself, why are there so either passive or enthusiastic cheerleaders for this genocide? Are you really going to trust them? Are you going to try and find out for yourself? So yes, I'm speaking with a lot of emotion now. I did give it into you an extensive one, a longer one, not so emotionally laden as these words have been now. But in light of the latest news from Gaza with apparently the cell phones, the internet being cut off, and the bombings being escalated, you know what? I'm upset. I'm really upset. I have a lot of feelings of pain. I know what happened to my own people. Nothing that happened to us in any way justifies what's going on right now. I'll stop there.
Gabor, well, we should definitely do a more extensive interview with you examining the psyche of Zionism in this current era, in this current phase, and possibly even the psyche of a population like that in Gaza Strip, which has been totally betrayed by the world and has taken on the role of one of history's greatest, most tormented victims, but which also is determined to resist with arms. But I want to get you now, before you go, to just respond to one thing. I just want to get your response to some comments Benjamin Netanyahu made before escalating the assault on Gaza. Sorry, and we lost volume there, so I started over.
People of the light, they are the people of darkness, and light shall triumph over darkness.
Let's hear that
People of
again.
the light, they are the people of darkness, and light shall triumph over darkness. Citizens of Israel, October 7th was a very dark and black day in our history. We will fully investigate what had happened at our southern border, the border with Gaza. Everybody will have to provide answers, myself included, but all that will happen only after the war. As a prime minister, I'm responsible for guaranteeing the future of this country, and now my role is to lead all Israelis, the state of Israel and the people of Israel, to an overpowering victory. It is now a time to come together for one purpose, to storm ahead to achieve victory. With joint forces and a profound belief in our justness, a profound belief in the eternity of the Jewish people, we shall realize the prophecy of Isaiah. There will no longer be stealing at your borders, and your gates will be of glory. Together we will fight. Together we will win. People of the
So he starts off by referring to people of the light versus people of the darkness.
I'm happy to respond. I completely agree with Netanyahu. The light will triumph over the darkness. He's just a bit confused as to what represents light and darkness. He's one of the darkest minds on the world stage right now. He dares quote prophecy. I'll give him prophecy. It says in the Tanakh, "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, you who yourselves strangers in Egypt." And what Netanyahu has devoted his career to is oppressing the other. And he dares prattle on about light. What we're witnessing there, and you know, with Netanyahu, it's like with many other politicians, turn off the sound. Just listen to their body language. What you're seeing there is a person so alienated from his humanity, so committed to his ego, that, as they say in Hungarian, whatever he says, not even the opposite is true. It's so false, not even the opposite is true. And yeah, Bibi, the light will triumph, despite whatever you can do. And you have a lot of power to impose a lot of suffering, and you will, because that's your nature. That's what you committed to.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gabor-Mate. I know you have to go, but I would love to see a more in-depth interview between you and Aaron along the lines of the one you did on Russiagate. Love to have you back, Aaron. I don't know if there's anything you want to.
No. Thank you, Dad, so much for joining us.
Yeah, and I'm happy to come back to talk about the psychological underpinnings of these events, for sure. Thank you both. Take care.
All right. Take care, Gabor. So that was the prophetic voice right there of Dr. Gabor-Mate. I think a much needed intervention today. It's very interesting to note Benjamin Netanyahu's language in the context of classically fascist rhetoric, but also as a preview of what was to take place. If something appears that's significant in a Netanyahu wartime speech, it's for a reason. He's not just speaking off the cuff. He was signaling that he was going to cut off the light, all light and communications to Gaza, in my view. And now if you actually look at a satellite image, like a Maxar satellite of Gaza versus Israel, they are the people with light, and the people in Gaza are the people in total darkness. I'll read a message I just got from a friend. My Palestinian friends who I grew up with have lost all contact with their relatives in Gaza. One friend lost 14 members of her family, including a 2-week-old baby. Our politicians in the UK, this is a British friend, have lost all credibility, especially Labour. The second Nakba is unfolding. And I've lost contact with all people I know in Gaza. So in some senses, what Netanyahu is saying is literally true, but you cannot see more darkness in the eyes of a world leader. I mean, I hasten to call him a world leader, but in the eyes of a leader than Netanyahu. And it actually echoes rhetoric he tweeted before the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital attack. He also referred to children of the light and children of darkness. He's been using this rhetoric a lot. He's trying to get Israel. He's pushing a religious war, even though he's not particularly religious, which is sort of one of the great contradictions of Zionism. You know, the first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, an atheist socialist who insisted that the Bible entitled him to the land. I don't believe in God, but God gave me the land.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu is also mobilizing support within the Bible Belt in the U.S. and the Republican Party for this religious assault. And they're reframing Hamas from a nationalist Islamist group that it is, whose armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, has consensus support within Palestinian society just because the act of armed resistance has consensus support. The political wing, maybe not, but they're reframing them as ISIS, as a global religious fascist entity, theocratic entity determined to establish a caliphate. And they are posing as the defenders of Judeo-Christian civilization. Netanyahu uses the language of the jungle versus the villa, Israel being the villa or the garden. And that's what's so dangerous about this moment. And the U.S. seems to have accepted that rhetoric.
Yeah, they're egged on by people like Lindsey Graham, who right at the start called for a religious war. Those are his words. Religious war, and he said, let's level the place, referring to Gaza. That's exactly what Israel is doing, and that's who their base is now inside the U.S. It's traditional neocons like Lindsey Graham, but also fanatic evangelicals.
Yeah.
And that combination is combining to produce Armageddon, to fulfill their own prophecy. And I mean, we'll get to this, and then now the question becomes: will other fronts open up? Already, as we're speaking, the U.S. bombed Syria hours ago in purported retaliation for attacks on its troops there. And no one ever questions, of course, why U.S. forces are in Syria. But for now, I mean, just speaking of the genocidal toll in Gaza, I think we got to play this clip from the White House spokesperson, John Kirby.
Yeah.
Who, the Biden administration is fully in lockstep with everything Israel is doing. The U.S. has instrumental leverage over Israel. Instead of using it to stop the assault, it's only trying to fuel it by arming Israel and blocking all diplomatic efforts. And John Kirby was asked at the White House about the toll so far of, I mean, now it's jumped exponentially, but at the time it was over 7,000 Palestinians killed. And he refused to accept that toll as legitimate.
The president yesterday, John, said he has no confidence in the death toll numbers presented by the Palestinians in Gaza. What's he basing that on? How did he reach this conclusion?
Well, we all know that the Gazan Ministry of Health is just a front for Hamas. It's run by Hamas, a terrorist organization. I've said it myself up here. We can't take anything coming out of Hamas, including the so-called Ministry of Health at face value.
President yesterday, John, said
I mean, first of all, I don't even think it's true that the Ministry of Health is run by Hamas. I believe it's under the authority of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But regardless, the State Department has used the Gaza Health Ministry's figures multiple times. So even what Kirby is saying there is contradicted by established U.S. policy. And even if that weren't U.S. policy, it would still be ridiculous what he's saying. But that's where we're at right now, is not just genocide abetting, but genocide denial.
John Kirby is such a fake little hypocritical crisis actor. I mean, he always cries fake tears. You can't even see the tears. It's the fakest fake crying I've ever seen for the victims of any official designated U.S. enemy. Like, he cried fake tears for Ukrainian civilians. And then when it comes to just regular people in Gaza being slaughtered, he said, and we don't have I don't have the clip in front of me, but to paraphrase it, he said, well, death happens in war and we just expect a lot of death. And this is what the death toll looks like in Gaza. These are the names produced by the confirmed death toll produced by Gaza's health ministry, including the ID numbers of every person killed. And it just goes on and on along with their ages. You can see 1, 2, 3, 28, 16, 5, 4. And we know of so many people who've been killed in recent days. Everybody I talk to has lost family members who lives in Gaza, or
and this
neighbors.
This is before today's carpet bombing. So you can't even fathom what that list will look like.
It just
now.
goes on and on and on. We're not even at 3,000 dead yet. This is something that, if you're involved in activist work, plaster these on wheat paste all around your city. Make everyone see these names. Bring them to rallies. Show these names everywhere, because the U.S. is denying that they exist, and it's calling them all human shields. This is the most ghastly dehumanization of a people by my government I've ever seen. And as I said, at the State Department briefing, it was the same talking points. They're human shields. We mourn the loss of civilian life, but we question these numbers by the Gaza Health Ministry. And it's because the PR price is just too much for the U.S. to bear. If they admit that Israel has slaughtered over 7,000, probably 8,000 by the end of tonight, in 2 weeks or so, how will that work with younger Democrats, for example? Because obviously all they care about is getting reelected at this point in the Biden administration. It's not clear to me they're trying to stabilize the region. How will that play?
And meanwhile, the Gaza municipality, a building that would be heavily involved in collecting figures like this, it holds Gaza's records and archives. They've warned that they've received a threat from Israel that they're going to be bombed. It's the headquarters for the city administration. It stood for nearly 200 years. This building houses vital city documents and archives, and the execution of the occupation threats to bombard it would plunge the city into significant chaos. So even the people who collect the records of the massacres of the people of Gaza are being erased. Even now, they're under threat.
Yeah, as I said last week, what Israel does is it just basically has a population register in its possession and an informant network. And they start with what they think their top level targets are. And then they move from there and eventually run out of targets. They start targeting any political activist, anyone they hear might be affiliated with Hamas, and they kill their entire family while they're in the home. 19 people, 15 people, the house collapses on them. And then they just tell the U.S., we're striking terror targets. I mean, the fact that anyone is using the language of terror targets at this point, or striking Hamas, is just scandalous. It's completely scandalous. Along with this generally tepid response of mainstream U.S. media. I mean, Jake Tapper's still in Israel doing like October 7th propaganda, and he's interviewing like an Israeli Israeli government asset, an Israel lobby propagandist who says he's the son of a Hamas leader. I mean, it's just the cheapest. They've run out of propaganda, and now they're just recycling Israeli foreign ministry propaganda. And meanwhile, I mean, their massacres are happening like this, and the Israeli public is not being shown 1 second of this. They're not seeing any of this. There's a total consensus support in Israeli society for carpet bombing Gaza right now. As Gideon Levy at Haaretz pointed out today, the left in Israel, the sort of respectable left there within like the Meretz party, whatever was left of labor, all those people protesting Netanyahu for quote unquote democracy in Tel Aviv have become the greatest cheerleaders for the war. And the right has descended into all out fascism as we see violent settler attacks on Palestinians that have killed dozens in the West Bank. So the reins are off. There's no political restriction on Netanyahu or the Israeli military to operate freely. And we're not seeing it from the US, at least publicly, although we do have some interesting news out of the UN. And I'm just going to make sure that I get this right. But there was well, it's completely worthless to Google anything at this point. But there was a Canadian resolution to call for a ceasefire. Or Canada abstained. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't, Justin Trudeau is such a...
Yeah. Well, it's still significant. Canada has abstained on an emergency resolution at the UN General Assembly calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. So it passed with 120 votes in favor.
Okay, so that's the UN General Assembly, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Not the
but it's
Security
significant that some, and Justin Trudeau was heckled earlier today by Canadian activists. He was booed at a mosque that he was attempting to visit over Gaza. And now he's abstained. The United States, you can see, is one of the 14 votes, along with some of its tools, the famously famous geopolitical power, Papua New Guinea, against this resolution. But Canada has abstained. I mean, look at how ardently Canada supported the proxy war in Ukraine.
Yeah. The UK also abstained.
Yeah.
I guess that's just a reflection of fear of their own populations, like the outrage that their complicity is causing. I guess they don't want to inflame that further by voting along with the US. So they have to abstain. But
well, and there's enormous pressure from, what we would think would be the vassal states in the Arab world. Jordan, Queen Rania declaring that the West doesn't care about Palestinian lives. King Abdullah denouncing the U.S. at a gathering of the Arab League. This is essentially the most complicit or compliant state in the Arab world. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was basically installed into power by the UK and the US, dressing down Tony Blinken when he was meeting with them. The US and by extension UK are facing a complete collapse of credibility, even among the governments that they essentially control in the Arab world. So the pressure is mounting, and it really helps explain the timing of whatever Israel's doing right now. And going back to a point I was making before, this is a little disjointed. Israeli society has it passed a transition point towards fascism with the election of Benjamin Netanyahu in 2009. And you would see these attitudes of Israeli youth who are indoctrinated to participate in the military through full conscription, expressing that kind of fascism, where the Israeli Democracy Institute around that time started documenting over 50% of Israeli youth declaring they would never live next door to an Arab. They would not want an Arab in their school. And the majority of Israelis telling the Israeli Democracy Institute Index that they favor the forced transfer of Palestinians. That was all leading up to now. But now it's just...
By the way, Max, you made a great video on this back then when you went and interviewed Israelis. And what did you call it? Feeling the hate in Israel?
Well, I did a series of Feeling the Hate, which is completely suppressed on YouTube. Feeling the Hate in Jerusalem has been banned by YouTube and Vimeo and everyone else. But yeah, I mean, that's when I started exposing what was going to happen, because I felt like it was building up to something that would lead up to regional war and possibly world war. And it emanates from this. It emanates from this mentality that we're now seeing, because we're now in an era of total social media proliferation, where the zeitgeist, the ugliest zeitgeist of a society, cannot be hidden. And the citizens are so proudly exhibitionist of their fascism that we see Israelis mocking. I mean, this is a trend now. Israelis mocking Palestinians for dying.
Oh,
and
this is sick.
youth
Just
involving their children as well. And everybody needs to look at this to see what Zionism has done to Jewish people living in Israel and Jewish people who support Zionism. These are entire families mocking families in Gaza for dying, involving their children. They think it's funny. This is just sheer, unadulterated sadism, and it's the mentality that brought Netanyahu's governing coalition to power and his war cabinet. And when you look at this, you say, what kind of government could even get away with a ceasefire or some kind of deal for captives with this population? When it has to be accountable to this population for votes. I don't think Israel will stop what it's doing in Gaza until it satiates the bloodlust of its citizens, unless somebody from outside stops it, whether they stop it through military force or they stop it through imposing diplomatic pressure. And right now the UN is completely failing to be able to do anything. It's just pure hatred. The contempt that you see on display there preceded October 7th, and I think precipitated October 7th. It's what precipitated it. And for many in Gaza, it was like, you know what? You've been treating us like animals, so to hell with you. That's not a mentality I support. I'm not condoning it. When you keep people in a cage for so long, and then you just start shaking the cage again and again, and they break out, do you expect them to throw candy on you?
Well, Max, speaking of shaking, I mean, so in Israel, you see on display there this insane sadism from its people, its politicians. And then what are you getting from, some segments, not us, obviously, but other segments of the American Jewish community? You have headlines like this in the New York Times: why Jews cannot stop shaking right now. This like ridiculous navel gazing and self-victimization is that somehow American Jews are under threat and they're the victims here. And they're the ones who should be worried, as their tax dollars are funding of genocide of people in Gaza. And their culture, I mean, our culture is being weaponized to inflict this catastrophe, this genocide inside Gaza. And yet, so the American Jewish culture, segments of it, liberal Zionist American Jewish culture, is navel gazing and self-victimization.
Yeah. I mean, you have a culture that is breaking apart and assimilating in the US, and they're looking for something to hold them together. And they thought they found it with Israel under attack. Finally, we can be the victim again. A lot of us are secular. We don't like going to shul, but we have this Zionist pillar that we can rally around. And for years, we've been told that they're the oppressor. It's apartheid. And now it's the Holocaust again. And you heard CNN anchors again and again, repeating the line, the worst killing of Jews since the Holocaust, constantly invoking the Holocaust and erasing the whole history of the siege of Gaza, the occupation of Palestine. And this is the kind of narcissistic, self-indulgent drivel, embarrassing, cringeworthy drivel that pours out in the pages of America's premier journals from the most affluent, privileged group living in a golden age in America. It's just so disgusting. And it actually is fueling anti-Semitism for non-Jews to see this kind of behavior. They might not
100%.
say it, but people are starting to, I think people are becoming resentful of this kind of entitlement.
As they should.
The disproportionality of violence is so extreme and so obvious for everyone to see.
Yeah.
I mean, think about Wild Dadu. He lost his entire family in a targeted airstrike, and he's on air the next day. But Jews in like New York are literally shaking, and they're literally shaking. They're not literally shaking, by the way. That's like some fake internet term. But yeah, they're playing the victim. They're trying to, and they're the biggest hypocrites to these kind of like neocons who emerged during like the late stage of COVID, like Barry Weiss, as these proud opponents of censorship, supporters of free speech, who, you know, like Barry Weiss didn't do anything about the mandates until the end when she realized it was popular. And she, you know, she quit the New York Times because, you know, they're not letting people denounce identity politics enough, and they're against wokeism. But when it comes to their own ethno-religious sect, their own ethno-religious group, if anyone touches a hair on their head, all of a sudden it's the second Holocaust, and anyone who says anything critical of them has to be fired from their jobs, defunded, totally destroyed, and their organizations have to be banned. They don't believe in free speech at all. They believe in a total Palestine exception for free speech. Barry Weiss has to be the biggest fraud in American media just because of that fake role of the courageous crusader against the woke mob. All those people that talk about the woke mob, and like I can mock the wokeism all day. All those people are the biggest frauds right now because they are part of the establishment identitarian Zionist mob that represents the elite institutions of America who can shut down speech with the stroke of a pen. We're seeing people fired in universities, shut down. Then there's this weird alliance. It's like those people, the neocons, and the many.
I mean, here's Nikki Haley. Here's Nikki Haley calling for the defunding of universities that allow what she calls anti-Semitism, which means criticism of Israel. This is the most insane advocacy for suppressing free speech that I can ever recall. And it's, as you say, Max, it's totally widespread.
Yeah. Well, what did Ron DeSantis do in Florida? He demanded the criminalization of Students for Justice in Palestine in Florida. And he had already passed, there's already been a bill passed, which he claims can mete out 30-year prison sentences for calling for the boycott of Israel. So he's openly calling for the criminalization of Palestine solidarity. The Defamation League, or the Anti-Defamation League, has declared that Students for Justice in Palestine and protesters who are protesting in solidarity with Palestine should be classified as a violent extremist groups by the US government. Basically, that protesting Israel should be an act of terrorism, according to the Anti-Defamation League, which has connections with law enforcement, federal law enforcement. So they're targeting activism across the board, these fake free speech warriors. And the anti-war right continues to be completely fake and has gone off the radar as the anti-war right. I mean, whatever. It was nice, nice seeing you guys care about the Ukraine proxy war. Now, let's redirect all our U.S. tax dollars to our apartheid colony in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's like that's the best that the so-called anti-war Republicans can do right now is they just want separate votes for Ukraine and Israel, and they'll probably vote for both anyway. But here's Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the House. He just gave an interview, expanding on these topics.
Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there. And it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them. We want to be cooperative. We need to work together on this, but we owe it to the people to know what the plan is, where the money's going to be spent, and we need some auditing for the dollars that we've already sent over there. These are not tough questions, right? One thing that House Republicans are resolved on is that we must stand with our most important ally in the Middle East, and that's Israel. We will. We certainly hope that it doesn't come to boots on the ground. If it comes to that, and we communicated this to the White House staff as well today, that we have the Article 1 power in the legislative branch of government, and they have Article 2. They have very limited authority on what they can do to respond without coming to Congress to seek consent. And even my Democrat colleagues, Sean, that are at committees of jurisdiction understand this in the Foreign Affairs Committee. And you've had...
So he's even leaving open the possibility of authorizing U.S. boots on the ground to fight alongside Israel.
Complete clown show. I mean, Mike Johnson is the embodiment of the clown show of U.S. politics. This is a guy who was the lawyer for the Ark Encounter Creationism Museum in Kentucky, where they teach visitors that man walked along with dinosaurs, as in the Flintstones, and they now feature a life-size replica of Noah's Ark in order to teach that the Bible was real. And his first act as speaker was to issue a resolution in support of Israel's assault on Gaza. And I think he's in Israel now? Or he's on his way there? I don't know. But complete clowns. And then you have Hakeem Jeffries on the other side, whose entire career was propelled by the Israel lobby. I mean, he wouldn't be there without pro-Israel money. And so, on the theme of Republican support for Israel, Israel's UN ambassador, and as we said earlier, Netanyahu's openly catering to their apocalypticist worldview, their eschatology, which sees Israel as the future landing pad for the Messiah following a horrible war, which includes Gog and Magog from the book of Revelations, which they see as Russia and Iran. You had the UN ambassador, Gilad Erdan, actually visit the largest Christian Zionist pro-apocalypse church in the U.S. To frame this war as a religious war. There they are, John Hagee's
In the words
Cornerstone
of
Church.
Isaiah, for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not remain quiet. We must stand together, Jews and Christians, in our holy mission for the truth.
Holy mission. And he's on stage at the UN right now denouncing the resolution.
Dear
like
friends,
a madman.
is a day of action. For tomorrow, our children and grandchildren will ask, how did you stand with Israel in her hour of need? We are all watching in horror as millions of Muslims around the world hold anti-Semitic protests
It's all Muslims.
supporting
That's
the
it.
genocidal Hamas terror. They are spreading this hate loudly, so we need to fight back louder. And Israel needs your voice. It's time to stand up and speak out. We need you now more than ever. We are united as a family because we always remember God's words. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you.
Well, there you have it from Israel's ambassador to the UN. Those who don't support Israel's assault on Gaza will be cursed by God. They are fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah, and Jews and Christians are in a holy mission against Muslims who are protesting around the world for Palestine, and no one else is protesting with them. And as Aaron pointed out earlier, Lindsey Graham has openly stated that this is a religious war. The whole framework of Hamas's ISIS aims to characterize this as a religious war. And the U.S. is helping guide Israel's military strategy along the lines of its assault on Raqqa, which was the base of ISIS. They're treating Gaza like Raqqa. Raqqa had 30,000 bombs fall, I believe. It was half of the city was completely destroyed. That's the U.S. counter-terror model. Just kill everybody. We're going to knock the hell out of ISIS. And that's what Israel's doing in Gaza. Where will this lead? Well, how can the rhetoric of religious war not lead to a regional war? And the U.S., as you mentioned, Aaron, the U.S. attacked Syria yesterday. Is there any? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the U.S. bombed Syria. This is not the first time Biden has done this. Trump also did this as well, and this follows, hundreds of Israeli airstrikes on Syria over the last many years, which the whole world just ignores because Syria, to date, is one of the most terrorized states in the world. If you add up the dirty war inflicted on it over the last decade, plus all the Israeli bombings, and everyone just looks away. And then the U.S. has troops in Syria, which nobody pays attention to because who cares? It's just U.S. boots on the ground stealing the oil and wheat of a war-ravaged country, all because the U.S. wants to deny Syria the right to breathe and to live because Syria successfully repelled the regime change war that the U.S. was actively involved in. And so accordingly, this leads to sometimes U.S. troops being struck and hit. And then Biden, rather than say, consider withdrawing U.S. troops, launches these bombings, as we saw yesterday. And the question is, where does this go? You have Russian forces also inside of Syria because they're actually invited by the Syrian government. So you have there the threat of direct confrontation between those forces because they're on opposing sides, amplified by the fact that there's now a proxy war going on between them inside of Ukraine. And who knows where that could lead to? I mean, Biden is just toying with unprecedented threats here for what? To preserve U.S. hegemony inside Ukraine via Ukraine, and to protect another proxy, to protect the hegemony of another proxy, which is Israel.
Yeah, you made such an important point. Russian troops are inside Syria. They're at Tartus on the coast of the Mediterranean. There's a naval base, and then there's the Khmeimim air base, a Russian air base in Latakia. What if those come under attack? I mean, if there is a regional war, how do the U.S. and Israel avoid attacking those? What does Putin do? What does Russia do? And is that part of the objective?
Yeah.
So it's not as though Russia is just simply isolated in an Eastern European theater here. And then you have the several U.S. bases in northeastern Syria. Aaron, you pointed out that they are there to steal the oil at the Kanoko oil fields around Deir ez-Zor. You constantly see these trucks going out through Iraq, just siphoning that oil in order to starve the Syrian state and to occupy the wheat fields that are the breadbasket of Syria. But they're also a tripwire for a potential war with Iran, a war that the Beltway Uniparty is lusting for. And here's someone who I forgot even existed. It's Joe Lieberman.
In short, is that we can't let the commanders of all this death, anti-American action in the Middle East to feel like they're in some safe sanctuary in Iran. It's time for the U.S. military to strike IRGC facilities, missile factories, drone factories in Iran, and let them know that we know that the Iranians are behind this, and we're not going to let them get away with it anymore.
Sorry to interrupt, but they're just saying, look at the Chiron, terror targets hit, and then you're just seeing entire families carrying wounded children through the street.
So just to be clear, you think that the U.S. should strike Iran right now?
I do, because none of this, Hamas would not be Hamas without Iran's support. They're a terrorist agent of Iran, which calls us still the great Satan. and Israel, the little Satan. And the same is true of Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, all the rest. And they're getting away literally with murder, including murder of Americans. Unless we make them pay for this soon, now, they will kill some American military personnel in Iraq. And it's nothing new for them. This Iranian government has the blood of Americans on their hands through their terrorist proxies and directly going back decades. And
so Joe Lieberman is now the head of the chairman of the United Against a Nuclear Iran, which is an Israel lobby front that is dedicated to lobbying for war with Iran. So he's sort of the titular head of an organization that has loads of money behind it and is dedicated to regional war, if not world war. And these calls are not isolated.
Yeah, and he's advocating just straight up the logic of terrorism, that you bomb civilian populations for the alleged crimes of their leaders. And by his logic, then, Iran and all its allies could carry out attacks inside the U.S. because the U.S. is supporting Israeli massacres inside Gaza. That you add up all the crimes of Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, and they don't compare. They pale in comparison to what Israel is doing to Gaza right now. So by his logic, and I'm not adopting it, but I'm saying, according to his logic, there could be targeting inside the U.S. And he, like, some people there call the U.S. the big Satan and Israel little Satan, and that's a reason to go to bomb people.
They're calling us names, so
yeah, there's a schoolyard now. Like, we bomb people because we get called names, as opposed to providing weapons that massacre children, like the U.S. is doing with Israel and Gaza.
The U.S. has set up so many tripwires for war with Iran, and just going back to that, the basing, the de facto basing in northeastern Syria, is a project of the neoconservative movement in Washington, which sabotaged from within. You can talk a little bit about that. The withdrawal that had been announced by Donald Trump. They're not supposed to be there. There was supposed to be a withdrawal, and they sabotaged it. Was it Jim Jeffries?
Jim Jeffrey, who was Trump's envoy to Syria, he even admitted that he lied to the White House about the number of U.S. forces inside Syria to mislead them and to get around Trump's order for them to withdraw. The entire Pentagon leadership basically stonewalled Trump. He's supposed to be the commander-in-chief. Whatever you think of him, he was elected. Supposed to be a chain of command. And Trump ordered a withdrawal from Syria, and Pentagon leadership and Trump's own envoy ignored it. And that's why U.S. forces are there, because James Jeffrey is among the most fanatical proponents of regime change in Syria. He's the one who said that Al-Qaeda in Syria is a U.S. asset because they can be used to go after the Syrian government. And he even communicated through intermediaries with the Al-Qaeda leader, Jolani, who now rules over Idlib. So these are the people who are running our policy, not even the elected leaders, but the bureaucrats who ignore orders for U.S. withdrawals and openly ally themselves with forces like Al-Qaeda. And now Israel turns around and says that we're fighting the equivalent of Al-Qaeda and ISIS inside Gaza, when in fact it's Israel and the U.S. that were allied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS inside of Syria.
And it was Israel that was working to establish a presence for ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the Syrian non-occupied side of the Golan, because they considered them allies in the fight against Iran and its allies. There's no dispute about that. Former defense minister of Israel, Moshe Ya'alon, openly stated that. We've heard this again and again from Israeli intelligence chiefs, but Jim Jeffrey, the liaison who helped preside over the sabotage of Trump's withdrawal, he's now part of the Israel lobby. I believe he's at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Am I right? And that is, that was originally started as the de facto think tank of AIPAC by Dennis Ross and some of the neocons who were around the Clinton and Obama administration. Actually, there's a fascinating profile at the Grayzone by Anya Parampil of Joe Kent, who is a Republican pro-Trump congressional candidate and former special forces officer who lost his wife, the mother of his children, in Syria after the withdrawal was sabotaged, and he began to dedicate himself. I mean, one of his main motivations for running for Congress was to get U.S. troops out of Syria and out of the region. So I thought that was, it's actually a very moving profile of someone, whatever you think of his views on domestic politics. And actually, we're going to bring Anya in a minute to just give us an update on what happened at the UN, because this all took place while we were streaming, Aaron. I don't know if I think we should just cover one more thing real quick, since we've been on the issue of Congress and domestic support for Israel's assault on Gaza. And this is the resolution passed by the Senate unanimously, declaring Palestine solidarity protesters on campus as, quote, in solidarity with Hamas and anti-Semitic. And it calls to fully and completely support Israel in its war on Gaza. And as Michael Tracy pointed out, everyone from Bernie Sanders to Ron Paul's son, Rand Paul, supported it.
You have to wonder about Bernie. And you raised this question, I think, Max, like, who is Bernie really? When he, in 2016, said some really powerful things about Palestinian rights, is that who he is? Or was he just pandering then for the Arab vote in Michigan? That was during the primary against Hillary Clinton. Because what is he doing now? The best he can muster, along with voting for these ridiculous resolutions, is to call for a humanitarian pause. That's like the furthest left we can get from the leader of the progressive movement, Bernie Sanders, is adopting Tony Blinken's language of a humanitarian pause, not a ceasefire, not an end. The best we can get for Bernie right now is him calling for a pause to the massacres, not an end to them. That's Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
So,
and it was because he came under pressure from 300 former staffers.
Right.
Which is, what kind of just, I think it's a larger conversation we need to have about the Democratic Party, because those staffers obviously were very progressive people who probably lined up with us on a lot of things, maybe not everything. But they insisted that there had to be a foothold within the Democratic Party, and that Bernie was a vehicle for change and reforming the Democratic Party. And many of them wound up going on to support Joe Biden, or at least holding their nose and voting against Biden to stop fascism. And I mean, what happens next? What do you do when Biden not only flouts international opinion, international law, UN votes, sabotages every ceasefire resolution, mocks Palestinian deaths, statistics of Palestinian deaths, lies, repeats Netanyahu's propaganda and lies to allow Israel to escalate. But he also just stomps on you personally and everything you believe, because he's just the status quo Joe, crime bill author we always knew was going to be there, who pronounced himself at AIPAC meeting after AIPAC gathering a Zionist. He's just being himself. Bernie's back to just being himself, the Bernie that Michael Parenti called in 2016 for supporting the war on Yugoslavia, the Bernie who yelled at his own constituents in 2014 and said, Israel has the right to defend itself, when it was butchering civilians in Gaza back then. This is just the Democratic Party as it always was. So what's next? Do they pay a price for this? Do they pay a price with young people who understand how important this is, who know what's happening in Palestine, who are out in the streets right now? Do they pay a price? Or are you going to fall back into line because you're so scared of Donald Trump and the fascists coming back into power? That's the question.
Yeah. And it's not just the politicians. Like in the case of Bernie, he has this foreign policy advisor named Max Hoffman, who comes from the Center for American Progress, this, whatever you want to call it, progressive kind of sometimes, but mostly neoliberal think tank in Washington. Before that, it was Matt Duss, who was not terrible on Palestine, but was in lockstep with the neocons and pretty much everything else, including the Ukraine proxy war.
And a hyper ambitious, he wanted a soft landing, golden parachute at a think tank, and he got it.
He got it. Yeah, and he got it. So the tolerance for these kinds of career climbers who will sell out basic progressive principles to get ahead in Washington, that needs to be called out too. And all these progressives who are now seeing Joe Biden's true face, who lined up with him 100% on Ukraine, and are now seeing Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, all of them making the explicit link between Ukraine and Israel, saying that we have to support both these conflicts, that they're exact same thing. I wonder if the progressives who've been with Joe Biden and his government on Ukraine are going to start to see the light and wake up and realize what they've been supporting, because all along Biden's been pursuing a neocon agenda. And so it's no surprise at all that he's extending that to Israel as well. And now Joe Biden is even adopting the language of Mitch McConnell when it comes to selling the Ukraine war. There was just a big article in Politico about how basically Biden's messaging on Ukraine is not working. So they've started to adopt the Mitch McConnell line, which is basically that funding the war in Ukraine is good for American jobs. And if you listen to Joe Biden's insane Oval Office address last week, that's what Biden said. And also he talked about Israel too, but the weapons we're sending to Israel are going to fund American jobs. So this is the headline. The White House is losing the messaging war in Ukraine. Now it's changing the message. The president's team is privately urging lawmakers to focus on the jobs that can be created by the money spent on the war. So all these progressive dupes who bought into this language that we're helping Ukraine defend itself from a Russian takeover, and that if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine, it will move on to the rest of Europe. Now even Biden is dropping that propaganda and going to something more accurate, although it's not the full story, but that this is done to benefit the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, he said we're the arsenal of democracy and it's creating jobs in Pennsylvania, and he rattled off a bunch of swing states. And it's also why John Fetterman has become the #1 supporter of grinding Gaza to the ground, and has put hostage photos, papered the walls around his office door with hostage photos, is because there's so many military related jobs and armament factories in Pennsylvania, which thrive off of foreign military aid to Israel and to Ukraine. I mean, and I don't even know if John Fetterman is even there. He's basically a cyborg at this point. But we're going to bring in Anya Parampil in 30 seconds. I just want to say one thing. If it is possible to make Joe Biden pay a price and to tell the Democrats that he actually suffered at the ballot box because he became Genocide Joe in Gaza, it can't be done within the Democratic Party. And it's not clear that it can be done with an independent candidate. So the possibility exists, though, for a protest write-in campaign, if it can get enough votes, possibly to write in a watermelon, which has become a symbol of Palestine in countries where the Palestinian flag is effectively banned, like Germany and like Israel. 50,000 people were to write in a watermelon, might send in a message. But I don't see any other way of sending a message. I want to bring in Anya right now, who's looking a little bored backstage. Welcome to the stream.
Hey guys, what's up?
Well, that's what we want to know. So as we were streaming, there was a important UN vote on a resolution. I guess it was to condemn Israel's actions in the occupied territories. Canada abstained, but tell us what really happened and what's going on at the UN.
Well, the vote was actually the most consequential vote to take place at the UN since anything broke out in October, since October 7th, since the Hamas military operation in Israel. and the subsequent exchange between Hamas and the Israeli army. For a while, the Security Council over the past several weeks have been debating it, and there was a back and forth between Russian and Western proposed resolutions, but then ultimately, because the Security Council comes down to veto authority, there was no ability, there was no consequential outcome from the Security Council. And so for this past week, there was a debate within the General Assembly, which is actually all 190 UN member states having the chance to debate this. We saw U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visit the General Assembly, as well as the Iranian foreign minister, the South African foreign minister. High-level diplomats actually from all around the world were in New York to debate this question over the past week. And it came down ultimately to a resolution that was authored by the Arab group, the Arab members of the United Nations, roughly 22 Arab states that are members of the UN, put forward a resolution that does not condemn either party. In fact, doesn't really name an aggressor or anyone to be at fault, simply is upholding the UN's supposed humanitarian mission. So the Arab group resolution that was just passed at the UN, what it does is call for an immediate, durable, sustained humanitarian truce between Israel and Hamas. And it demands continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provisions of life-saving supplies and services for civilians trapped inside Gaza. And so this resolution was up authored by the Arab group. And at the last minute, Canada stepped forward with its own amendment to this resolution, essentially taking the resolution that was just there authored for humanitarian purposes and then made it explicitly about condemning Hamas and blaming Hamas for the recent violence and completely warping the purpose of the resolution in order to make it from about calling for an immediate humanitarian solution to just condemning Hamas and reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself, etc. And so this afternoon, there was a brief debate on allowing that Canadian amendment. The Jordanian delegation spoke out first on behalf of the Arab group, denouncing the Canadian resolution. Canada then spoke in favor, and the Canadian resolution promptly fell flat. So essentially I'm going to look up the exact numbers right now that I have saved right here. The Canadian resolution condemning Hamas failed. 88 states voted in favor, 55 voted no, 23 abstained. Canada lost the vote by 8 votes because you have to get a 2/3 majority for something to pass at the UN General Assembly. And then the Arab group resolution came in with no condemnation of either party, simply about getting humanitarian supplies in and calling for an immediate ceasefire. That passed. 120 states voting in favor, 14 no, 45 abstained. And what was interesting about that vote is the United States, and you can see even Ian Bremmer and Western analysts right now are on Twitter acknowledging that the U.S. was alone. Other than a few client states, you have the Marshall Islands and
Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, the usual suspects voting alongside the United States. The European powers, Germany, France, others actually abstained from this, which is significant. If the U.S. can't get its own allies and Israel cannot get its own allies to vote against or veto this basic resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, durable, sustained humanitarian truce, and a delivery of humanitarian aid. And, what was particularly fascinating during this vote, as many states, especially the Arab group states, were noting, Israel has escalated over the past several hours its operation in Gaza, this long-awaited ground military offensive that, I personally thought that it was kind of out of the question at this point. Israel was pushing ahead. As we know, they cut off all satellite communication, Gaza's essentially under a blackout as a result of the last several hours. The only information we can get out are thanks to outlets such as Al Jazeera that have capacity to be in touch with their correspondents there. Israel has completely cut off electricity and communication capabilities from Gaza, and was making in the north, it seemed, pretty aggressive incursions to actually have this ground assault take place. And so as I was watching international media all day, there was a sense or a view that Israel was going ahead with this aggressive position on the ground in Gaza now as a result of this UN vote, and the fact that they knew they were poised to lose, that they were going to be called to withdraw or have a humanitarian an outcome, and so they want to have something spark off, or they were pretty much just like sending a message to the international community over the last several hours that they don't even care what anyone thinks, and ultimately the UN doesn't have a mechanism to enforce anything. So that's where we are. And you should have seen, I wish we could pull up the meltdown that the Israeli representative had afterwards. I took some notes about what he said. He said that the vote that ultimately called for a humanitarian solution, again, did not condemn either side, including the Israelis. He said it proved that that the UN has no ounce of legitimacy. He said it was founded in the wake of the Holocaust, but the spectacle of this vote proves the UN is committed to ensuring, not preventing, the continued atrocities that it said. He said that it is voted to show that Israel has no right to defend itself, no right. And then this was the worst part. At the end, after giving this insane speech, where obviously, yeah, the UN didn't vote that Israel has a right to defend itself, because according to international law, it actually doesn't. The Palestinians have a right to resist. He closed by saying that just today, my government, Israel, has presented evidence that the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza is a center, a base of operations for Hamas. And he said that the international community is failing to acknowledge this, ignoring basically Israel's intelligence. What he's doing right there, we know Al-Shifa has already been warned. It is the largest hospital in Gaza. Israel has already... What more can it do other than hit this hospital? And that was how he concluded his speech, his meltdown at the international community for failing to condemn Hamas. He ends it by basically saying, well, now we're going to bomb this hospital. I mean, I don't take it any other way when the Israelis start speaking about a hospital or a target in that way, that they are saying they're going to strike it.
Where, as Max mentioned earlier, tens of thousands of people are sheltering on top of all the vital life-saving work that is going on there, with doctors who already lack the basic supplies they need to do their work. And the so-called intelligence Israel presented, we talked about this before earlier, it amounts to an animation video that Israel put together. And there's obviously fake recording between two Hamas militants, or purported Hamas militants, that happens to confirm Israel's allegation, which we saw after the bombing of the hospital. Israel put out another recording that also happened to magically confirm Israel's allegations, and that's the supposed intelligence we're supposed to take at face value.
Right. I think I saw someone on Twitter make the point that Israel miraculously has all of these phone calls proving its narrative, but yet could not prevent the October 7th incursion. They're that brilliant.
So what happens next at the UN? I mean, this was a General Assembly vote, but you have the Security Council and the US veto. Does the UN have any ability to affect the outcome on the ground?
No, the UN ultimately has no mechanism to enforce this vote. And ultimately, Israel is sending a message, as I said, to the international community while this is all taking place, that it does not care what anyone thinks. I mean, that is the purpose of the Israeli operation behavior today, is they're saying, look, no matter how you vote, they have zero regard, and you're getting all these conflicting reports about even certain elements within the United States growing concerned with where this war is going. I mean, they could just pull back and stop. Why aren't they? Antony Blinken, when he was at the UN this week, he claimed, along with other US officials, that the US doesn't want war with Iran. They claim they don't want escalation. Well, then why last night did they bomb Iranian targets in Syria? What is the goal at this point? I personally, the UN has no option here, but I don't see any off ramp. And this was all happening at the UN while these reports about the potential for a Qatari brokered prisoner swap were also breaking today. You noticed that there were these reports at Al Jazeera and other outlets that the Qataris had actually possibly brokered a deal between Israel and Hamas to swap the final hostages, which would be the best outcome for everyone. But it seems like there's this faction of the Israeli and US establishment that still want to keep pushing toward war. I don't think there's a cohesive strategy on either end. I think there's just one radical group across both entities that is pushing us toward a war with Iran and everything that they've been, pushing for since the Project for a New American Century began.
Yeah, since the Wolfowitz doctrine started to take shape on the international stage, I mean, we're still seeing it, but pushing against unprecedented resistance. And as I pointed out in my piece I published yesterday on Israel killing Israeli civilians using heavy weapons on October 7th in attempts to dislodge Hamas gunmen, bombing homes in kibbutzim in Be'eri, where the most civilians or non-combatants were killed, opening fire randomly on cars going to and from Gaza after the fence was breached, many cars that had Israelis in them, with Apache helicopters. Won't have time to probably cover this piece, but I ended the piece explaining how the Israeli military establishment actually opposes these captive releases because they're delaying this ground invasion that they continue to promise, and they're making Hamas look humanitarian or humane in comparison to themselves. You're also seeing families campaigning for the release of their family members in Tel Aviv and outside the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem, actually getting physically attacked by Israeli bystanders who have been whipped up into this genocidal frenzy, and they see them as the only obstruction between the ground invasion that will satiate their bloodlust and a ceasefire. And so those families are left out in the cold. And the Al-Qassam brigades have reported that around 50 Israeli captives have already been killed by Israel. Do they actually want them back? No, I don't think so. I don't think they want to pay the political price. They're trying to eliminate any political pressure on the international stage at the UN. They're threatening Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General. They said he doesn't have a visa. He can't come to Israel. He can't come on a birthright trip or whatever. And they are trying to prevent any political pressure at home that stands in the way of this mass bombardment and possible ground invasion of Gaza. And that means eliminating the captives, eliminating them. They're killing captives in Gaza. And if their intelligence is so great and they have all these phone calls and they know where all the tunnels are, then they know where the captives are. And this is the Hannibal Directive, the secret military procedure that Israel initiated that allows it to kill captives who are Israeli citizens to prevent politically painful prisoner exchanges for the thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are in Israeli jails who have been kidnapped effectively, including some 700 children. Some 700 Palestinian children are in prison. Thousands of Palestinians are in prison without charges under administrative detention. And so they're trying to prevent that. They don't care. It doesn't seem they care about Israeli life as much as they care about killing Palestinians.
This was in the times of Israel. The Israeli army is concerned that further hostage releases by Hamas could lead the political leadership to delay a ground incursion or even halt it midway. So if this account is correct, then the Israeli military is worried that the release of more hostages could impede its plans to launch a ground invasion of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, you had the release of Yohanan Lifshitz, the 85-year-old peace activist who was captured, and she was let go with her 79-year-old friend. Israel initially rejected their release. Then when they accepted them, she was seen clasping hands with a Hamas militant and wishing him shalom on her way out. And then she delivered a press conference stating that she was treated extremely well by her captors once she arrived in Gaza. She described, quote unquote, going through hell to get there. And so the Israeli government propagandists have been basically stating if anyone else gets released, they can't give a press conference. This was a disaster for us. So they're hostile to releasing the captives because of what they'll say about Gaza. I mean, a lot of them are actually people more on the left of the spectrum from the southern kibbutzim that are out of step with Israel's current leadership. So this was a disaster for them. It's not about the captives. It's not about freeing them. It's about regime change in Gaza, which will mean mass elimination of the civilian of civilians there. It can't be achieved without Stalingrad levels of casualties. That's where we're at right now. Anya, anything you, thanks also for that excellent update. Anything you want to add before you go?
Well, I wish I had actual like sources or insight to give, but it is always interesting just to follow the UN in that way anyway. Just, to close, a few weeks ago, and maybe you can find it, Max, we were watching that 60 Minutes report about the Israelis that were protesting Netanyahu before all this began. And one of the protest leaders was this female Israeli helicopter pilot who says, and maybe if you can find the clip, something along the lines of, when she's complaining about Netanyahu, she says that if you are asking helicopter pilots to strike a home knowing they could be killing innocent women and children, then they have to have the utmost belief in their government. Like, what? You mean if you believe in your government that you will execute children and women and children? Like, wow, that's a messed up way of thinking. But when she was wait, let me just make my statement and then I'm going to log off and you can close with that. When she's making that statement, she's thinking about Palestinians. What's interesting about your report, and now what we're seeing is the reality in Israel, is that can also mean Israeli civilians in a kibbutz. Do you trust your government? Are you going to fire on your own countrymen? Apparently so, if you trust them. So just a different way of interpreting the warped mind of Israelis. And
the Israeli police or the Israeli government has now issued live fire orders, allowing local police precinct captains to open fire on anyone approaching without permission from commanders. So let's, I guess, ready ourselves for more friendly fire, fratricide incidents like the many we saw on October 7th, which could have accounted for hundreds of the Israeli casualties that we saw that day. But Anya, thanks so much for that awesome update.
All right. I'll catch up with you guys soon.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, we might as well show that clip that Anya mentioned. This is from 60 Minutes during the so-called pro-democracy protests against Netanyahu. And keep in mind that the Air Force pilots that are bombarding Gaza come from the cream of Israel's enlightened public. They come from mostly the Ashkenazi elite. They tend to be the most educated members of the Israeli army, and they are responsible for the most casualties in Gaza right now. And, they do it with a push of a button. As former Israeli Air Force Chief of Staff Dan Halutz said, "I feel nothing when I drop a bomb below. I feel nothing but a bump in the plane." He said that about authorizing a strike on an entire apartment block in Gaza that killed some 30 people.
If you want pilots to be able to fly and shoot bombs and missiles into houses knowing they might be killing children, they must have the strongest confidence in the people making those decisions.
The moral values of them.
If you want
the moral values of them.
The moral values of the baby killers.
We need moral baby killers. And basically they're saying we need someone who's not Netanyahu so we can kill babies. And, we don't want to exceptionalize Netanyahu. So many of the worst military operations were carried out under the Labor Party, the so-called left of the Israeli political spectrum. So, but those are the pilots in the air right now. We haven't seen any ground incursion. I raised the question 2 weeks ago about whether Israel would be able to mount a successful ground incursion. It's obvious they have no plan, but will this backfire, causing massive casualties among Israeli forces, which are notoriously poor in face-to-face close quarters combat and casualty averse, deepening Israel's societal crisis. I mean, Israel was totally divided before October 7th. I think this was a factor in why Hamas decided to execute its operation. But yeah, I think they'll have. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the White House just put this out, saying that the Biden administration is urging Israel to rethink its plans for a major ground offensive in the Gaza Strip and instead opt for a more surgical operation on high-value Hamas targets and infrastructure. So this is the White House leaking to the Washington Post that it opposes an Israeli ground invasion and instead favors so-called surgical strikes, which means carpet bombing, as Israel's doing currently, and also the U.S. did in places like Raqqa and Mosul. But the question is, why is the White House leaking that? Is that just to save face? Is it just face-saving PR so that when Israel escalates its genocide with the ground invasion, that the White House can claim that it was opposed to it? When the same article admits, buried at the bottom, that even though the U.S. is supposedly opposed to a ground invasion, it's not threatening to impose any consequences on Israel whatsoever. Because of course it's not. Or is the White House doing this as a prelude to Israel actually backing off and not going ahead with the ground invasion instead just continuing to carpet bomb? I don't know, but at least they're trying to make it look publicly as if they don't support it, when in reality they're doing nothing to oppose it.
I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying we will do a ground invasion, inshallah. He's basically refusing to give a timetable. There could be a limited ground incursion. There could also be no ground incursion if somehow the U.S. steps in via Qatar and organizes some kind of deal for the release of the captives, which would still be politically controversial in Israeli society. Most of the Israeli public wants to see what they have been promised, and they believe the lies that they have been told, which is that Israel can march into Gaza City and just remove Hamas ISIS and install some puppet government like they have in Ramallah, and that everything will be fine. They believe their military can do it. And I don't know if that's going to be possible, but the political pressure, Netanyahu has created this scenario where he has to execute an operation that cannot be completed. The promises can't be fulfilled. And we're looking at something that might be more foolhardy than Russia's initial plan when it went into Ukraine, thinking that there was going to be some kind of political solution early on as it moved towards Kiev. I mean, I don't even know if that's the right comparison, but there are several X factors like Hezbollah in the north, which is held back so far, and I hate to use the Iranian proxy language, it's not correct, but Iranian allies in Iraq, and Iran itself has been issuing some strong warnings, but would obviously probably prefer to hold back. It's a tinderbox. And what I'm saying here is that Israel is such a destabilizing factor. It's such a politically destabilizing factor in that region, and it has so much political power in Washington and so much impunity that it doesn't necessarily matter what the Biden administration wants or what any of the powerful regional players want when you have this wild, mad, irrational, rabid dog that's off the chain right now and is being guided by the most extreme elements in its society. So it's hard to predict. And I wanted to talk more about my article, but I think we should probably wrap it up just to kind of sum up the piece. It relates to this part of the conversation about is irrationality, disproportionate force, the indiscriminate use of weapons against civilians. Because when Israel was overwhelmed on October 7th, it had no response in its strategic arsenal other than disproportionate force, which happened to be directed against its own population. So in my piece, I use Hebrew language media testimonies of eyewitnesses to Israel's response on October 7th, as well as visual evidence of the supposed Hamas crimes, the most grisly crimes that are being presented by Israel on the international stage, to show that Israel may have killed large numbers of its own civilians, including non-combatants, in an effort to dislodge Hamas gunmen. And that's not to say that Hamas militants did not intentionally kill large numbers of Israelis, but they had small arms. They entered on foot and on motorcycles with Kalashnikovs. But what we saw in, for example, Kibbutz Be'eri, is every home was destroyed. They were destroyed with tank shells. And now we have admissions in Haaretz, only in Hebrew, that those houses were shelled in a deliberate military order, knowing that Israeli civilians were inside. And so then you see all these charred bodies, burned bodies in cars. You have Apache helicopter pilots saying, we were operating without any intelligence. We didn't know who was on the ground, but we had to fire everything we had. So you see all these photographs of cars that have completely been bombed out and the bodies inside are completely charred. Are we to believe that Hamas gunmen were able to meticulously burn every car and burn every home and somehow blow up these homes and reduce them to rubble and make them look like the damage we see in Gaza? So what we saw, Israel bombed its own base, its own military base at the Erez crossing. That's the biggest nerve center of the siege on Gaza. It was overwhelmed by Hamas militants and they bombed it with helicopters, with Hellfire missiles. And now the roof is off. The base is like mostly destroyed, and they had all their civil administrators inside. So now they're using these photos of charred bodies to say that Hamas burns people, that they rape people, and not to say that there were not atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. But it's amazing how the Israeli response on October 7th was so badly botched. There was so much friendly fire, and now they're using that to make way for more atrocities, senseless atrocities in Gaza, including the killing of Israeli captives, so the killing of more Israeli citizens. So this article, I think it needs to be translated into Hebrew. This needs to reach the Israeli public, the consciousness of the Israeli public. Anyone who can see right now what their military is doing and how little regard they have for Israeli life. They need to demand an independent investigation. And Netanyahu is saying, we're going to do that after the war. Don't talk about that, because he knows how sensitive it is. So it's so important to focus on that. And our own media hasn't touched this. It's a major story. It's one of the biggest stories of the war. Our own media hasn't touched it. Electronic Intifada did it. Mondo Weiss has touched it. We are on it. Our media won't touch it. So they need to engage with the fact that Israel's killed and is killing its own citizens senselessly.
And Max, just so nobody twists what you're saying, because people will try to. I don't hear anything in what you've written. You acknowledge that obviously some Israeli civilians were killed by the militants, whether they were Hamas.
Well, I said, yeah, and I said that. I said that in the piece, and I just said that now. The point is, what were the weapons that we saw? I mean, Hamas recorded it. So first of all, they recorded themselves in Israeli military bases. There are close to 900 confirmed Israeli deaths, which is 500 less than the figure that we have been told since the beginning of 1400. If, Biden and his team want to challenge the Palestinian death toll, then two can play that game. The confirmed deaths are now at 900. Almost 50% of those deaths are uniformed Israeli soldiers who are actively engaged in the siege of Gaza and were combatants engaged in an act of war on October 7th.
And people can verify that themselves if they want to by going to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper that has a tool, and that's where those figures are coming from.
Okay, so yes, exactly. So go see for yourself. So that's 50% of those deaths around. And then there are many armed Israelis, who people who were carrying guns in their homes. It's a very armed society. But the Hamas militants filmed much of that with GoPro cameras and with cell phones and put it online. And also GoPro cameras were recovered from dead Hamas militants and have been put online at like the Telegram account of South Responders, which is an Israeli rescue organization. And then they've been fed to the media as part of Israel's propaganda. And they do show them actually shooting some people with Kalashnikovs. And it is pretty clear that they were setting up checkpoints and shooting motorists who were passing by, escaping from the Nova Music Festival. But we don't see any evidence that they were able to burn every home in a kibbutz and reduce the homes to rubble, or burn all these bodies in cars. Those are the telltale signs of hellfire missiles and tank shells. And so that's what I'm saying. And that tactic may have caused heavy death tolls. Again, it's all to avoid the scenario of negotiation, in my view.
Yeah, and this QR code that the Israeli ambassador asked people to scan, right, to take people to evidence of that Israel had collected supposedly against Hamas. You were in your article, you talk about this, that the file online that goes to was actually some of the pieces of so-called evidence were deleted.
Yeah, Gilad Erdan has actually the UN ambassador who waived that QR code. As soon as he waived it, I went there, and first of all, the photos were questionable themselves. But second of all, they all disappeared, and now he's gone on Twitter and complained that they were all taken down because of complaints, because he's basically putting snuff films on a Google Drive and distributing it across the internet, basically like burned body parts. But as I pointed out, one of those photos that he was promoting as Hamas atrocities showed a pile of burned, comprehensively charred bodies in a dump truck. Okay, we saw video after video, and I linked to it in my article. I definitely am not showing it here, of Israelis defiling the corpses of Hamas activists and gunmen and everybody killed who came in from Gaza. Some of the people who came in were just onlookers. Defiling them in the most disgusting way, stripping them, urinating on them, mutilating their body parts. Israelis who were killed that day were taken away in body bags individually to mortuaries and to forensic pathologists. So it's pretty obvious that the Israeli rescue crews or whoever arrived on the scene dumped dead Hamas militants in a dumpster after they were killed in either a tank strike or a Hellfire missile strike. They missed that. That was essentially defiling their bodies. They would have never done that to Jewish Israelis. So Gilad Erdan was promoting dead Hamas gunmen as evidence of Hamas atrocities, or to essentially say that they burned Israelis and put them in a dumpster to reinforce the point that Hamas is ISIS. And so that disappeared, and now he's saying it was just a glitch.
Yeah, and this follows, as you talked about a lot, this attempt to roll out this lie about 40 beheaded babies, right, which was spread around a lot, and then ultimately that was retracted. So there's ample grounds to be skeptical of everything that Israel has said, and your report at the Grayzone.com is trying to look at some of the available evidence that comes from, as far as I understand your story, it comes from Israeli sources.
100%, and you can just look at the visual evidence. And I also relied on documentation of my own in Gaza in 2014, where like a car of a taxi driver named Fadel Alawan, who was killed by a Hellfire missile strike from a drone after he dropped a wounded fighter off at a hospital without knowing it. He didn't, and they just killed him. So I got to look at his car in Gaza City. It looked just like the cars that you see in the Israeli propaganda that they're saying Hamas burned. And I actually remember looking in his car and seeing his sandal melted into the gas pedal. Only a Hellfire missile can do that and have that much precision. So I think there's another piece to be done, and it's about the source of the beheaded baby's claim. We nailed one of the sources, who happened to be an extremist settler who was a reservist who got to Kibbutz Be'eri and just fed this lie to Israeli journalists. But there's another source behind so many of these claims, like, for example, that Hamas cut the fetus out of a woman, and it's one rescuer who's part of this rescue crew called Zaka. And basically everyone's just taking these people at their word without doing any examination. I think one day there will be an independent commission, and it will bear out a lot of the points that I'm making, that a lot of people on the Israeli left, the radical left in Israel, are making right now, and which a lot of the families of captives are quietly discussing, but which they're afraid to say in public. And it's, again, it's one of the biggest stories of the war, and the whole US and Western media won't touch it.
In the US, I've only seen, apart from the Grayzone, there were stories earlier on in the Electronic Intifada and also Mondo Weiss to this effect. But otherwise, this aspect's been totally ignored.
Well, we're gonna stay on it, and incredible contributions today from Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know where you found that incredible guest, Aaron, but we really appreciate you efforting that and getting access to people like that. That was supposed to be
important. You know, it's important right now. I mean, a genocide's being committed before our eyes, as Gabor talked about. The Western media, politicians are cheering it on. And so it's important in times like this to hear from survivors of previous genocides. In his case, the Nazi Holocaust, which is now being invoked to commit this new Holocaust. And so I really appreciate hearing from him too. And we're going to keep covering, obviously, this unfolding genocide, where, as we've acknowledged during the stream, I mean, sometimes just the words aren't there because it's just so unbelievably horrific.
Yeah, and I would just say, observing you over the years, Aaron, you go through extreme pains and contortions to maintain the most moderate presentation and rhetoric. So when you say something like genocide, contains a lot of gravity. And also excellent contribution from Anya Parampil. Check out her upcoming book, Corporate Coup. It's available for pre-order at OR Books. Like this stream, because we are suppressed, often demonetized. Subscribe to the Grayzone here. We're going to hopefully stream next week also on Rumble, because I'm starting to get sick of what YouTube is doing. Visit the site, thegrayzone.com, for our investigative reporting. We're on Rockfin, and we're on Pacifica, KPFK LA on Sundays, on Tuesdays, and WBAI New York on Sunday. We'll be back several times this week, I hope. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for all your support. We really appreciate you. Hang in there. And thanks a lot, Aaron.
Thank you, Max.
All right. Peace.